Karen Mitchell had always believed the world owed her something. At 52, she carried herself with an air of entitlement that made cashiers cringe and waiters exchange knowing glances. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her nails freshly manicured, and her voice perpetually raised in complaint about one thing or another. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Karen was already having what she considered a terrible day. Her coffee had been too hot at the cafe, the taxi driver had taken what she deemed the wrong route, and now she found herself standing outside Buckingham Palace, frustrated that the tour she'd booked online was fully booked despite her confirmation email. The palace stood majestically before her, its grand facade gleaming in the morning sun. Tourists clustered around the famous black iron gates, cameras clicking, children pointing excitedly at the red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. But Karen wasn't interested in the spectacle. She was focused on what she saw as a problem that needed her immediate and forceful intervention. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she muttered to herself, pulling out her phone to check her confirmation email for the 10th time. The screen clearly showed her booking reference, the date, and the time. She had paid good money for this tour, and no one was going to tell her it was fully booked. Marching up to the nearest palace staff member, a young woman in a navy blazer holding a clipboard, Karen launched into her complaint. "Excuse me, I have a confirmed booking for the palace tour, and your people at the gate are telling me it's full. This is completely unacceptable." The staff member, Sarah, looked at the confirmation email with genuine concern. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. It appears there was an overbooking error in our system. We can reschedule you for tomorrow at the same time, or offer you a full refund plus a complimentary gift from our shop." But Karen's face was already turning red. "Reschedule? Do you have any idea how much trouble I went through to be here today? I specifically took time off work, arranged my entire schedule around this, and now you're telling me to come back tomorrow? This is completely unprofessional." Sarah maintained her composure, her training kicking in. "I understand your frustration, and I sincerely apologize. Let me see what other options we might have available today." As Sarah made some calls, Karen's attention wandered to the ceremonial guards standing at attention near the palace entrance. These were not the famous beefeater guards in their ornate uniforms, but rather members of the Queen's Guard in their distinctive red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. She had read somewhere that these guards were not supposed to move or respond to tourists, no matter what happened around them. James Crawford had been standing at his post for exactly 47 minutes. At 26, he was a proud member of the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army. His military bearing was impeccable, his uniform pristine, and his dedication to duty unwavering. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning this prestigious posting, and he took the responsibility of guarding the monarch's residence with the utmost seriousness. The morning had been relatively quiet. The usual stream of tourists had gathered to watch the guards, many hoping to get a reaction or trying to make them laugh. James had learned to tune out the chatter, the camera flashes, and the occasional inappropriate comment. His focus remained laser-sharp on his duty, scanning for any potential threats while maintaining the stoic composure expected of the Queen's Guard. He could see a commotion developing near the visitor entrance, where a middle-aged American woman was becoming increasingly animated in her discussion with palace staff. James had witnessed countless such scenes during his 6 months at this posting. Disappointed tourists, scheduling conflicts, and general complaints were part of the daily backdrop of palace life. What James couldn't have predicted was that this particular tourist was about to make him the focus of her frustration. After 20 minutes of increasingly heated discussion with Sarah and 2 supervisors, Karen had worked herself into a state of righteous indignation. The palace staff had been polite but firm in their position that no additional spaces were available on today's tours. They had offered her multiple alternatives, including a behind-the-scenes tour scheduled for the following week, but Karen was having none of it. "This is exactly what's wrong with customer service today," she declared loudly, her voice carrying across the courtyard and drawing stares from other visitors. "No one takes responsibility, no one goes the extra mile, and everyone just hides behind policies and procedures." It was then that her gaze fell upon James, standing at attention in his magnificent red uniform. An idea began to form in Karen's mind, born from years of believing that the right amount of pressure applied to the right person could solve any problem. "You know what," she said to Sarah, "I'm going to speak to someone who actually has some authority around here." Before Sarah could respond, Karen was striding purposefully toward James's position. The young palace employee hurried after her, a sense of dread building in her stomach. "Ma'am, please, you can't approach the guards directly," Sarah called out, but Karen was already beyond listening. James noticed the approaching woman before she was halfway to his position. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening in his peripheral vision while maintaining his forward gaze. He could see her determined stride, her flushed face, and the palace employee trailing behind her looking distressed. Standard protocol was clear: maintain position, do not engage with tourists attempting to interact, and alert other security personnel if the situation appeared to escalate beyond normal tourist behavior. James slightly adjusted his grip on his rifle and prepared to stand his ground. Karen stopped directly in front of James, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the slight scent of perspiration from her agitation. She looked up at him expectantly, waiting for some acknowledgement of her presence. "Excuse me, I need to speak with you about the absolutely terrible service I'm receiving here today," she began, her voice loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. James remained motionless, his eyes focused on a point somewhere above her head. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for. Tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, and, while most were harmless attempts at humor or curiosity, some could become more persistent. "Hello? I'm talking to you," Karen said, her voice rising slightly. "I know you can hear me, and I know you're trained to help visitors when they need assistance." This was factually incorrect, but James wasn't about to correct her. His job was to guard the palace, not provide customer service to frustrated tourists. He continued his practice stillness, a skill that had taken months to perfect. Karen's frustration was mounting rapidly. Here was someone in an official uniform, clearly in a position of authority, and he was completely ignoring her. In her worldview, this was not just rude but a direct challenge to her right to be heard and helped. "This is exactly the kind of arrogance I've been dealing with all morning," she announced to the growing crowd of onlookers. "I have a legitimate complaint, and everyone here just pretends I don't exist." Sarah had finally caught up and was now standing beside Karen, trying to gently guide her away from the guard. "Mrs. Mitchell, please, the ceremonial guards aren't able to assist with tours or bookings. Let me continue working on your situation." But Karen shook off Sarah's gentle hand on her arm. "No, I've had enough of being shuffled around. This young man works for the palace, and he's going to listen to what I have to say." She turned back to James, who continued his stoic stance despite the growing spectacle around him. Other tourists had begun to notice the confrontation and were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "I demand to speak to your supervisor," Karen said, now standing even closer to James. "I have rights as a tourist and a taxpayer, and I'm not going to be treated like this." James could feel the situation escalating but remained committed to his duty. He had been in far more dangerous situations during his military service, and an upset tourist, while unpleasant, was hardly a threat. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. It was this apparent indifference that finally pushed Karen over the edge she had been approaching all morning. "Fine, if you're going to act like a statue, I'll treat you like one," she declared, and, before anyone could stop her, she reached out and placed her hand firmly on James's chest, pushing slightly as if to test whether he would react. The moment her hand made contact with his uniform, several things happened simultaneously. James felt the inappropriate touch but maintained his discipline, though every muscle in his body tensed. Sarah gasped audibly and immediately stepped forward. Other palace security personnel, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, began moving quickly toward the scene. But Karen wasn't finished. Emboldened by what she perceived as James's lack of response, she continued her inappropriate contact. "See? Just a costume and an attitude," she said to the crowd, her hand still pressed against his chest. "These people think they're so special, but they're just employees like everyone else." What Karen failed to understand in her moment of entitled fury was that she had just committed a serious offense against a member of the British military in the course of his official duties. The touching of a Queen's Guard without permission wasn't just inappropriate tourist behavior, it was a criminal act that could result in arrest and prosecution. James could see the plainclothes security officers approaching from his peripheral vision. In approximately 30 seconds, this situation would be taken entirely out of his hands and into the realm of palace security protocols. He made a split-second decision that would define the rest of this encounter. For the first time since Karen had approached him, James allowed his eyes to move, looking directly down at her with a gaze that conveyed years of military training and absolute authority. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable tone of command that had been honed through years of service. "Ma'am, you need to remove your hand and step back immediately." The crowd fell silent. Karen, who had been expecting continued silence or perhaps some stammered explanation, was completely taken aback by the quiet authority in his voice. For the first time all morning, she found herself speechless. But the moment of silence was brief. Karen's embarrassment at being publicly corrected by someone she had been trying to intimidate quickly transformed into an even deeper anger. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she snapped, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I'm a paying visitor here, and I have every right to." She never finished the sentence. Two plainclothes security officers arrived at James's position, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the guard immediately," said the lead officer, a stern-looking man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Karen looked around, suddenly, aware that she had become the center of attention for dozens of tourists, all of whom had their phones pointed in her direction. The reality of her situation was beginning to dawn on her, but her pride wouldn't allow her to simply comply. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "All I did was try to get some help with a legitimate complaint. This guard was ignoring me, and I was just trying to get his attention." The security officer's expression remained neutral but firm. "Ma'am, physical contact with the Queen's Guard is not permitted under any circumstances. I'm going to need you to come with me so we can discuss this situation properly." Sarah, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, stepped forward. "Officers, Mrs. Mitchell has been frustrated about a booking issue. I've been trying to help her resolve it." But the security officer shook his head. "While I appreciate the context, ma'am, the situation has moved beyond customer service concerns. Physical contact with a guard on duty is a serious matter that requires proper documentation and investigation." Karen's face went pale as the implications of what was happening began to sink in. "Investigation? What investigation? I barely touched him. This is completely blown out of proportion." The second security officer, a woman with short gray hair and kind but serious eyes, spoke up. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this may seem overwhelming, but assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Guard is taken very seriously. We need to follow proper procedures." "Assault?" Karen's voice reached a pitch that made several tourists step back. "I did not assault anyone. I simply placed my hand on his uniform for a few seconds. This is absolutely insane." James, meanwhile, had returned to his position of attention, though he remained acutely aware of everything happening around him. He could see other guards at their posts maintaining their own discipline despite the commotion. The professionalism of his colleagues in not being distracted by the scene gave him pride in his regiment and his service. The lead security officer maintained his calm demeanor despite Karen's rising hysteria. "Ma'am, unwanted physical contact with a military personnel in the performance of their duties constitutes assault under British law. The severity of the charges will depend on several factors, but we need to address this through proper channels." Karen looked around desperately, seeing her situation with sudden clarity. The circle of tourists with their recording phones, the serious expressions of the security officers, and the unwavering professionalism of the guard she had just touched all combined to create a picture very different from the one she had imagined when she woke up that morning. "Look, I apologize if I overstepped," she said, her voice now taking on a pleading tone. "I was frustrated about my tour booking, and I made a mistake. Can't we just forget this happened?" But the security officer shook his head. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, ma'am. Once a complaint of this nature has been made, we're required to follow specific protocols. I'm going to need you to accompany me to the security office where we can properly document what occurred." As the reality of her situation fully hit her, Karen felt her legs go weak. This was not how her day was supposed to go. This was not how her life was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the one making complaints, not the one being complained about. The walk to the security office felt like the longest 100 yards of Karen's life. Flanked by the two officers, with dozens of tourists watching and recording, she felt the weight of her actions settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Behind her, James remained at his post, his duty unchanged by the morning's events. But, as he stood there in the growing warmth of the London sun, he knew that this encounter would have consequences that would ripple far beyond this single moment. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The security office at Buckingham Palace was nothing like Karen had imagined. She had expected something grand and intimidating, but instead found herself in a modest, windowless room with grey walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested this space was designed for function rather than comfort. Chief Security Officer David Thompson had been handling incidents at the palace for nearly 15 years, and he had seen every type of tourist mishap imaginable. Drunk visitors trying to climb the gates, protesters chaining themselves to the railings, and countless attempts by overeager tourists to get reactions from the guards. But physical assault on a Queen's Guard was relatively rare, and it required a specific set of procedures that he took very seriously. Karen sat in a plastic chair across from Thompson's desk, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. The confident, demanding woman who had marched up to guard Crawford just an hour earlier had been replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the gravity of her situation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Thompson began, his tone professional but not unkind, "I need to explain what happens next. When a member of the public makes physical contact with one of our guards without permission, it's treated as a criminal matter. The Metropolitan Police will need to be involved." Karen's face went white. "The police? But I'm an American tourist. I didn't know there were special rules about touching the guards. Surely there's some kind of warning system for first-time visitors?" Thompson opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. "I understand you're from out of country, Mrs. Mitchell, and that will certainly be taken into consideration. However, ignorance of the law isn't typically considered a complete defense. The guards are serving military personnel, and assaulting a service member is a serious offense in any country." "Assault," Karen repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "I keep hearing that word, but I barely touched him. My hand was on his chest for maybe 10 seconds. How is that assault?" Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying Karen's face. He had learned to read people during his years in security work, and he could see that her belligerence was gradually giving way to genuine fear. "Mrs. Mitchell, assault in the legal sense doesn't require injury or even significant contact. It's about unwanted touching of another person without their consent, particularly when that person is unable to defend themselves due to their official duties." The reality of her situation was finally penetrating through Karen's usual layers of self-justification. She thought about her job as a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company, her mortgage, her reputation in her community back in Ohio. The idea of having a criminal record, of being arrested in a foreign country, was starting to feel very real and very frightening. "What exactly is going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice much smaller than it had been all morning. Thompson consulted his notes. "The responding officers from the Metropolitan Police will take a formal statement from you and from Guard Crawford. They'll review the video footage from our security cameras, which clearly shows the incident. Based on that evidence, they'll determine what charges, if any, to file." "Charges?" Karen whispered. "Multiple charges?" "Potentially, yes. Assault on a military personnel, disorderly conduct, and possibly others depending on how the Crown Prosecution Service views the evidence." Karen felt dizzy. This was spiraling completely out of her control, and, for the first time in years, she found herself in a situation where her usual tactics of demanding to speak to managers and threatening negative reviews were completely powerless. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, James Crawford was giving his own statement to Detective Inspector Sarah Williams of the Metropolitan Police. Unlike his earlier encounters with frustrated tourists, this conversation required James to break from his usual stoic demeanor and provide detailed, accurate testimony about what had occurred. "Guard Crawford," Detective Inspector Williams began, "I need you to walk me through the entire incident from the moment you first noticed Mrs. Mitchell approaching your position." James sat straight in his chair, his military bearing intact even out of uniform. He had changed into his regular service dress for the interview, but his posture and manner remained those of a soldier on duty. "Ma'am, I first noticed the subject when she was approximately 50 meters from my post, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with palace tour staff." Her voice was elevated, and her gestures indicated significant agitation. Detective Inspector Williams nodded, making notes as James spoke. She had interviewed many military personnel over her career, and she appreciated their typically precise and factual approach to giving statements. "When did you determine that she might approach your position?" "When she broke away from the conversation with staff member Sarah Jenkins and began walking directly toward me, ma'am." Her stride and direction of gaze made her intention clear. James continued his account in the same measured, professional tone. He described Karen's initial attempts to engage him in conversation, her increasing frustration at his lack of response, and the gradual escalation of her behavior. "At what point did you feel the situation required intervention by security personnel?" Williams asked. "When Mrs. Mitchell placed her hand on my chest, ma'am. Physical contact with a guard on duty is strictly prohibited, and I could see that she was becoming increasingly agitated rather than less so. My training indicated that the situation was likely to escalate further without intervention." Williams looked up from her notes. "And how did you respond to the physical contact?" "I maintained my position and bearing, ma'am, but I did speak to Mrs. Mitchell to instruct her to remove her hand and step back. At that point, security personnel arrived to handle the situation." "In your professional opinion, Guard Crawford, did Mrs. Mitchell's actions constitute assault?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. His personal feelings about the incident were irrelevant. What mattered was the factual assessment of what had occurred. "Yes, ma'am. Unwanted physical contact with military personnel in the performance of their duties meets the legal definition of assault. The intent or severity is less relevant than the fact that contact occurred without permission and against standing regulations." Detective Inspector Williams closed her notebook. "Thank you, Guard Crawford. Your statement has been very clear and helpful. We'll be reviewing the video evidence and determining how to proceed from here." As James left the interview room, he felt a complex mix of emotions. He took no pleasure in seeing a tourist face serious consequences for what might have been a moment of poor judgment. But he also understood the importance of maintaining respect for the institution he served in, the boundaries that protected both guards and visitors. Back in the security office, Karen was learning about those same boundaries from a very different perspective. Chief Thompson had returned with more paperwork and a grim expression that made her stomach clench. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've spoken with the responding officers, and they're going to need to take you into custody for formal questioning at the station." Karen felt the world tilt around her. "Into custody? You mean arrested?" "Yes, ma'am. You'll be formally charged and processed, though given your status as a foreign national with no criminal history, you'll likely be released on bail pending trial." The word trial hit Karen like a physical blow. In all her 52 years, through all her complaints and confrontations and demands to speak to managers, she had never imagined herself as a criminal defendant. "I want to call my husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thompson nodded. "You'll be allowed to make phone calls once you're processed at the station. You may also want to consider contacting the American Embassy. They can provide assistance to U.S. citizens facing legal issues abroad." As if summoned by the mention of her nationality, Karen's mind immediately went to what this would mean for her life back home. Her job required travel, and a criminal conviction could affect her ability to work. Her neighbors, her friends, her family, what would they think when they found out she had been arrested for assaulting a royal guard? The thought of having to explain this to her husband Michael was almost unbearable. Michael, who had always been embarrassed by her confrontational approach to customer service issues. Michael, who had begged her to just try to enjoy their London vacation without getting into arguments with every service worker they encountered. "How long will this process take?" she asked Thompson. "That depends on several factors. If you cooperate fully and the evidence is clear-cut, which it appears to be, you could be processed and released on bail within 24 to 48 hours. The trial itself, if it goes to trial, would be scheduled several weeks or months out." "If it goes to trial? Is there a chance it won't?" Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not an attorney, and I can't give you legal advice. But I will tell you that the Crown Prosecution Service does consider factors like intent, criminal history, and cooperation when deciding whether to pursue charges. Having a good solicitor will be important for you." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Detective Inspector Williams entered, followed by a uniformed officer who was carrying what Karen recognized with horror as handcuffs. "Mrs. Mitchell," Williams said, "I need to place you under arrest for assault on a military personnel. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the formal caution continued, Karen found herself floating outside her own body, watching this happen to someone else. This couldn't be happening to her. She was the wronged party here. She was the one who had been treated poorly by the palace staff. She was the victim. But, as the handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists, that narrative finally crumbled completely. For the first time in her adult life, Karen was forced to confront the possibility that she might not be the victim in this story. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of London streets and mounting panic. Karen stared out the window of the police car, watching normal people going about their normal days, completely unaware that her own normal day had transformed into a nightmare of legal consequences and public humiliation. At the station, the booking process was methodical and humiliating. Her personal effects were catalogued and taken away. Her fingerprints were recorded, her photograph taken from multiple angles. She was asked dozens of questions about her identity, her background, her reason for being in the UK. Through it all, Karen kept thinking about the moment when she had placed her hand on James Crawford's chest. It had seemed so insignificant at the time, just a gesture to get his attention, to assert her right to be heard. Now that single action was defining her as a criminal, a threat, someone who couldn't be trusted to interact appropriately with others. In the holding cell, Karen finally allowed herself to cry. Not the angry, frustrated tears she had shed during countless customer service disputes, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who was beginning to understand that her actions had consequences she had never considered. The concrete walls around her seemed to echo with every entitled demand she had ever made, every time she had raised her voice at a service worker, every moment she had treated another human being as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a person to be respected. Hours passed before Karen was allowed to make her phone call. Her hand shook as she dialed Michael's number, dreading the conversation she was about to have. "Hello?" Michael's familiar voice sounded so normal, so far removed from her current reality. "Michael," she said, and then, the words stuck in her throat. "Karen? Where are you? I thought you were supposed to be back at the hotel hours ago." She started, then stopped. "How do you tell your husband that you've been arrested for assaulting a royal guard? How do you explain that your inability to control your temper has finally led to serious consequences?" "I'm in jail, Michael," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm in a London jail, and I've been arrested." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like forever. "What happened, Karen?" Michael's voice was quiet, controlled, but she could hear the disappointment underneath. It was a tone she had been hearing more and more frequently in recent years, though she had chosen not to acknowledge it. As Karen tried to explain the morning's events to her husband, she found herself struggling to make her actions sound reasonable, even to herself. Every justification she offered sounded hollow when spoken aloud, every excuse felt empty. Michael listened without interruption until she finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Karen had never heard before. Karen, he said slowly, I've been watching you become angrier and more demanding every year. I've tried to tell you that your behavior toward service workers and strangers was getting out of hand. But you never listened. And now. He trailed off, but Karen could finish the sentence herself. Now she was sitting in a jail cell, facing criminal charges, because she had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The consequences were just beginning. The holding cell at Paddington Green Police Station became Karen's world for the next 18 hours. The narrow bench, the fluorescent lights that never dimmed, and the constant background noise of a busy metropolitan police facility created an environment that was alien to everything she had ever experienced. Karen had always prided herself on being in control of her surroundings. Her home in suburban Cleveland was perfectly organized, her office meticulously arranged, her daily schedule planned to the minute. But, here, stripped of her phone, her purse, and her ability to demand immediate attention, she was forced to confront the reality of powerlessness. The duty solicitor assigned to her case was a tired-looking woman in her 30s named Emma Hartwell. She arrived at the station early the next morning with an overstuffed briefcase and the weary expression of someone who had seen every type of tourist mishap London had to offer. Mrs. Mitchell, Emma said as she settled into the chair across from Karen in the consultation room, I've reviewed the initial reports and the video evidence. We need to discuss your options. Karen looked up hopefully. After a night of fitful sleep on a thin mattress, any discussion of options sounded like salvation. Can you get the charges dropped? This whole thing is completely out of proportion to what actually happened. Emma opened her file and pulled out several documents. Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. The video footage from the palace security cameras is very clear. It shows you approaching guard Crawford, attempting to engage him in conversation, becoming agitated when he didn't respond, and then placing your hand on his chest while he was on duty. But I barely touched him, Karen protested. And I was frustrated because no one would help me with my legitimate complaint about the tour booking. Emma looked at Karen with the patient expression of someone who had explained the law to many clients who didn't want to hear it. The strength of the contact isn't the issue, Mrs. Mitchell. What matters is that you made physical contact with a serving member of the military while he was performing his official duties. Under British law, that constitutes assault regardless of your intent or the force involved. Karen felt her last hope of easy resolution slipping away. So what are my options? You have 3 basic choices, Emma explained. First, you can plead not guilty and fight the charges at trial. However, given the video evidence and the testimony from Guard Crawford and the palace staff, the likelihood of success would be very low, and the potential penalties would be higher if you're convicted. Karen's stomach dropped. What kind of penalties? For assault on military personnel, you could face up to 6 months in prison and a substantial fine. Your status as a foreign national might affect sentencing, but it's not something I'd want to rely on. The thought of 6 months in a British prison was terrifying beyond anything Karen had ever contemplated. What's the second option? You could plead guilty and hope for leniency based on your lack of criminal history and your status as a tourist who may not have understood the seriousness of her actions. The court would likely be more lenient, but you would still have a criminal conviction. Karen closed her eyes, trying to process the enormity of what was happening to her. A criminal conviction would affect everything: her job, her ability to travel, her reputation in her community. Her employer had strict policies about criminal activity among management staff. And the third option? The Crown Prosecution Service sometimes offers what's called a conditional caution for first-time offenders in cases like this. You would have to admit guilt, but instead of going to trial, you would accept certain conditions, likely including a fine, community service, and possibly anger management counseling. This was the first thing Emma had said that didn't sound like a complete disaster. That sounds better than the other options. How do I get that? Emma's expression remained cautious. It's not guaranteed, Mrs. Mitchell. The CPS would have to agree to offer it, and it would depend on several factors including your cooperation, your remorse, and your willingness to accept responsibility for your actions. The words "accept responsibility" hung in the air between them. Throughout her life, Karen had become expert at finding reasons why her problems were always someone else's fault. The bad service, the incompetent staff, the unreasonable policies, there was always someone else to blame when things went wrong. But, sitting in this sterile consultation room, facing the possibility of 6 months in prison, Karen was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. This time, the problem was entirely of her own making. "I need to think about this," she said finally. Emma nodded. "You have time. Your bail hearing is this afternoon, and, assuming you're released, we can discuss strategy over the next few days. But, Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand something important. The video footage of this incident has already appeared on social media. Multiple tourists recorded what happened, and it's spreading rapidly online." Karen felt like she had been punched in the stomach. In all her worry about legal consequences, she hadn't fully considered the modern reality of viral videos and internet fame for all the wrong reasons. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Emma pulled out her phone and showed Karen a Twitter feed. The video, shot from multiple angles by different tourists, showed Karen's entire confrontation with James Crawford in damning detail. Her raised voice, her aggressive body language, her inappropriate touching of the guard, and her subsequent arrest, all of it preserved in high definition for the world to see. But, worse than the video itself were the comments. Thousands of them, from people all over the world expressing outrage, disgust, and derision. The hashtag Karen's Royal Guard was trending, and the video had been viewed millions of times. Entitled "American Tourist Assaults Queen's Guard," read one typical comment. "This is why the world hates American tourists," said another. "What an absolute disgrace of a human being," declared a third. Karen stared at the screen in horror. This wasn't just about legal consequences anymore. Her name, her face, and her worst moment were now permanently etched into the internet for anyone to find. Her reputation, her privacy, her ability to move through the world anonymously, all of it was gone. "How is this legal?" she whispered. "Don't I have any privacy rights?" The incident occurred in a public space, and you weren't in custody when it was filmed, Emma explained gently. "Unfortunately, the public has every right to record and share what happened." Karen thought about her friends back home, her coworkers, her neighbors. By now, they would have seen the video. Her phone, currently locked away with her other possessions, was probably filled with messages ranging from concern to condemnation. The bail hearing that afternoon was a blur of legal proceedings that Karen barely understood. The magistrate, an elderly man with penetrating eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed her case with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen countless similar situations. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said finally, "you are charged with assault on a military personnel. Given your lack of criminal history and your status as a foreign national, I am prepared to grant bail pending trial. However, there will be conditions." Karen felt a rush of relief that was immediately tempered by anxiety about what those conditions might be. "You will surrender your passport to the court," the magistrate continued. "You will not be permitted to leave the United Kingdom until this matter is resolved. You will report to Paddington Green Police Station twice weekly. And you are forbidden from approaching within 500 meters of Buckingham Palace or any other royal residence." The reality of being trapped in London, unable to return home to her familiar life, was almost as frightening as the prospect of prison. Karen nodded her understanding, having no choice but to accept the terms. Outside the courthouse, Emma walked with Karen toward the street where Michael was waiting. He had flown in from Cleveland overnight, arriving just hours before the bail hearing, and Karen could see the exhaustion and disappointment in his face. "Mrs. Mitchell," Emma said as they reached the sidewalk, "I need you to think very carefully about what you want to do next. The prosecution is likely to make a decision about offering a conditional caution within the next few days. If you want to pursue that option, you'll need to demonstrate genuine remorse and acceptance of responsibility." Karen looked at her husband, standing beside a black taxi with his shoulders slumped in defeat. In 28 years of marriage, she had never seen him look so defeated, so ashamed to be associated with her. "What does that mean exactly?" Karen asked. "Demonstrating genuine remorse?" Emma chose her words carefully. It means acknowledging that your behavior was inappropriate and harmful, accepting full responsibility for your actions, and showing that you understand the seriousness of what you did. The prosecution will be looking for evidence that this was aberrant behavior that won't be repeated, not just an unfortunate misunderstanding. As Emma departed and Karen approached Michael, she could see her reflection in the taxi's window. The perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her expensive clothes wrinkled from the night in custody, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. She barely recognized herself. "How bad is it back home?" she asked Michael as they settled into the back seat of the taxi. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the London traffic. "Your sister called me after she saw the video," he said finally. "So did your brother. And your boss. And about 20 other people." Karen closed her eyes. "What did they say?" "What do you think they said, Karen?" "They're horrified. They can't believe you would do something like this. And, honestly, neither can I." The word stung, but Karen could hear the pain underneath Michael's anger. This wasn't just disappointment in her actions, this was the frustration of someone who had been watching his wife become someone he no longer recognized. "I was frustrated about the tour," she began, but Michael cut her off. "Stop," he said firmly. "Just stop. I've heard you blame other people for your behavior 1,000 times over the years, and I can't listen to it anymore. You put your hands on someone who was doing his job. You created a scene that embarrassed not just yourself but our entire country. And now you're facing criminal charges because you couldn't control your temper over a tour booking." The taxi pulled up outside their hotel, a modest establishment in South Kensington that was now going to be their home for an indefinite period. As Karen climbed out of the car, she noticed other guests staring at her, some taking surreptitious photos with their phones. The video had made her recognizable. Even here, in a foreign country, she was now the Karen who assaulted the royal guard. There would be no anonymity, no escape from the consequences of her actions. In their hotel room, Karen finally saw the full extent of her internet infamy. Michael's laptop displayed dozens of news articles about the incident, social media discussions dissecting her behavior, and think pieces about entitled tourist behavior and respect for military personnel. "American tourist arrested for assaulting Queen's Guard," read the headline on BBC News. The article included statements from palace officials about the seriousness of the offense and quotes from military experts about the importance of respecting soldiers on duty. But it was the comments sections that truly drove home the depth of public condemnation. People from around the world were expressing their disgust with her behavior, with many calling for the maximum possible penalties. "She should be banned from the UK for life," wrote one commenter. "This is exactly the kind of ugly American behavior that gives us all a bad reputation," said another. Karen found herself reading every comment, each one feeling like a personal attack on not just her actions but her worth as a human being. For someone who had spent years demanding that others treat her with respect, the experience of being universally condemned was devastating. As night fell over London, Karen sat by the hotel room window looking out at the city that had become her prison. Somewhere out there, James Crawford was probably at home with his family, his duty completed, his life continuing normally despite the morning's incident. But, for Karen, everything had changed. Her return flight was cancelled, her passport confiscated, her reputation destroyed, and her future uncertain. The confidence she had felt just 36 hours earlier, when her only concern was a tour booking issue, seemed like a lifetime ago. She thought about the moment when she had first approached James Crawford, so certain of her right to his attention, so convinced that her frustration justified her actions. That woman, demanding, entitled, oblivious to boundaries, felt like a stranger now. The question that kept running through her mind was whether this transformation was too late to matter. Would the court see evidence of genuine change, or just the desperation of someone facing consequences? Would her family and friends be able to forgive her, or was the damage to those relationships as permanent as her criminal record was likely to be? As Karen prepared for what might be many more nights in this London hotel room, she realized that the real trial had already begun. Not the legal proceedings that would determine her criminal liability, but the much more personal reckoning with who she had become and whether she had the courage to change. 3 weeks had passed since Karen's arrest, and London had transformed from a vacation destination into a city of waiting and reckoning. The hotel room that she and Michael now called home felt smaller each day, the walls closing in as the weight of her situation pressed down upon them both. The conditional caution offer had arrived from the Crown Prosecution Service on a grey Thursday morning, delivered by Emma Hartwell with the matter-of-fact professionalism that Karen had learned to both appreciate and dread. The terms were more extensive than Karen had expected, but infinitely preferable to the alternative of a trial that could result in imprisonment. "You would plead guilty to assault," Emma explained as they sat in a coffee shop near the legal offices. "In exchange, you would pay a fine of £3,000, complete 100 hours of community service here in London, attend anger management counselling for 12 sessions, and write a formal letter of apology to Guard Crawford." Karen stared at the legal documents, the black text on white paper that would define the next phase of her life. How long would the community service take? At 20 hours per week, about 5 weeks. Plus the counseling sessions and time to complete the apology letter to the court's satisfaction. You're looking at roughly 2 months before you could return to the United States. 2 months. 8 weeks of remaining in London, facing the consequences of her actions while her life back home continued without her. Karen thought about her job, which was currently being handled by her assistant under the fiction that she was dealing with a family emergency abroad. How long before that explanation wore thin? "What kind of community service?" she asked. Emma consulted her notes. "Likely working with organizations that support veterans or military families. The court believes there would be some educational value in having you understand the perspective of those who serve." The irony wasn't lost on Karen. She would be spending her days helping people like James Crawford, the very person she had wronged through her thoughtless actions. Michael, who had been mostly silent during these legal discussions, finally spoke up. "What happens if she refuses this offer?" "Then, we proceed to trial," Emma said simply. "With the video evidence and witness testimony, conviction is almost certain. Mrs. Mitchell would face up to 6 months in prison and a much larger fine, plus a permanent criminal conviction that would be more serious than a caution." Karen looked at her husband, searching his face for some indication of what he thought she should do. Over the past 3 weeks, their relationship had been strained nearly to the breaking point. Michael was supportive but distant, helpful but hurt. She could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he married with the person he had watched on that viral video. "I think you should take it," Michael said quietly. "And I think you should be grateful that they're offering it." That afternoon, Karen signed the papers accepting the conditional caution. As her pen moved across the signature line, she felt the weight of formally admitting guilt for the first time in her life. It was a strange sensation, this acknowledgement of wrongdoing without the accompanying justifications and blame-shifting that had become her standard response to any accusation. The anger management counseling began the following week with Dr. Patricia Reeves, a soft-spoken therapist whose office was located in a converted Victorian house in Hampstead. Dr. Reeves specialized in helping clients understand the roots of their aggressive behavior and develop healthier coping mechanisms. "Tell me about the morning at Buckingham Palace," Dr. Reeves said during their first session. "Walk me through what you were feeling as events unfolded." Karen had told this story dozens of times by now, to police, to lawyers, to Michael, to herself during countless sleepless nights. But, somehow, sitting in Dr. Reeves's comfortable office with its soft lighting and warm colors, she found herself telling it differently. "I was frustrated," she began, then stopped. "Actually, I was more than frustrated. I was angry that my carefully planned day wasn't going according to schedule. I had this tour booked, and when they told me it was full despite my confirmation, I felt like they were dismissing me." "What did that dismissal feel like?" Karen considered the question. "Like I didn't matter. Like my time and my money and my plans were less important than their system or their procedures." "And how did you typically handle feelings of not mattering in the past?" The question hit Karen unexpectedly hard. She thought about all the restaurant managers she had demanded to see, all the customer service representatives she had berated, all the times she had raised her voice to get attention when she felt ignored or dismissed. "I made sure I mattered," she said slowly. "I made sure people paid attention to me, even if that attention was negative." Dr. Reeves nodded. And, when the guard didn't give you that attention, what happened to those feelings? They got worse. Much worse. Here was someone in a uniform, someone who represented authority, and he was completely ignoring me. It felt like the ultimate dismissal. Over the following weeks, Dr. Reeves helped Karen begin to understand the patterns that had led to that moment at Buckingham Palace. The childhood experiences of feeling overlooked in a busy household. The career built on demanding respect through force rather than earning it through collaboration. The gradual escalation of aggressive behavior as each success in getting her way reinforced the belief that loudness and persistence were the keys to being heard. The guard was trained not to respond to you, Dr. Reeves pointed out during one session. His lack of reaction wasn't personal dismissal, it was professional duty. But, your internal narrative made it about your worth as a person. Karen was beginning to see how her perception had shaped her reality for years. Every slow cashier became a personal affront. Every policy she disagreed with became evidence that she was being treated unfairly. Every no became a challenge to fight rather than an answer to accept. The community service assignment came through during her third week of counseling. Karen would be working with an organization called Support Our Soldiers, which provided assistance to military families dealing with deployment stress, financial hardship, and transition challenges. The irony was profound. Karen Mitchell, who had assaulted a military service member, would now spend her days helping military families navigate their daily challenges. Her supervisor at the organization was a former Army officer named Colonel Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s whose no-nonsense demeanor reminded Karen uncomfortably of herself, but with a warmth and respect for others that Karen realized she had long ago lost. Mrs. Mitchell, Colonel Morrison said on Karen's first day, "I want you to understand something. The families we serve here are dealing with real hardships. Deployments that separate them from their loved ones for months at a time. Financial struggles while supporting our national security. Children who miss their parents and spouses who carry the weight of single parenting while their partners serve abroad." Karen nodded, feeling suddenly small in the face of these real problems that dwarfed her complaints about tour bookings and slow service. Your job here will be to provide practical support. Filing paperwork, organizing food distributions, helping with childcare during support group meetings. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary work. The first family Karen was assigned to help was the Johnsons, Maria, whose husband was deployed in Estonia, and their 2 young children, ages 6 and 4. Maria worked 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet while David was overseas, and the stress was evident in every aspect of her daily routine. Karen's task was to help Maria navigate the bureaucracy of military family services, filling out forms for emergency financial assistance and organizing the documentation needed for base housing applications. It was tedious work that required patience and attention to detail, qualities that Karen had rarely applied to helping others. But, as she sat across from Maria at the kitchen table of their small apartment, watching the young mother struggle to complete complex paperwork while her children played nearby, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine empathy. "I don't understand why they make these forms so complicated," Maria said, frustrated tears threatening to spill over. "I just need help with groceries until David's next pay comes through." Karen looked at the form, designed by bureaucrats who had probably never faced financial hardship themselves, and she felt a familiar flash of anger. But, this time, the anger wasn't directed at Maria or even at herself. It was directed at the system that made life unnecessarily difficult for people who were already sacrificing so much. "Let me help you with this," Karen said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "We'll get through it together." As the weeks passed, Karen found herself becoming genuinely invested in the families she was helping. She learned about the unique challenges of military life, the uncertainty, the frequent moves, the constant worry about loved ones in dangerous situations. She met children who hadn't seen their fathers in 8 months, spouses who managed entire households while carrying the emotional weight of supporting a deployed partner. The work was humbling in ways that Karen hadn't anticipated. These families were dealing with real hardships, not imaginary slights or minor inconveniences. They approached their challenges with resilience and grace that made Karen's past behavior seem petty and selfish by comparison. One particularly meaningful interaction came during her 6th week of service. Karen was helping organize a holiday party for military children when she met 8-year-old Tommy, whose father was a member of the same regiment as James Crawford, the Coldstream Guards. "My daddy stands really still at the palace," Tommy told Karen proudly. "He protects the Queen and he's very important." Karen felt her chest tighten as she listened to Tommy talk about his father's service. This child saw the Guards not as tourist attractions or sources of frustration, but as heroes doing important work. The pride in his voice when he talked about his father's duty made Karen's actions at Buckingham Palace seem even more shameful. "Your daddy is very important," Karen agreed, meaning it completely. "And very brave." The letter of apology to James Crawford proved to be the most difficult part of Karen's sentence. She had written dozens of drafts, each one sounding hollow or self-serving when she read it back. How do you apologize for treating someone as less than human? How do you express genuine remorse for behavior that had been captured in viral video for the world to see? Finally, after her 10th counseling session with Dr. Reeves, Karen found the words, "Dear Guard Crawford, I am writing to apologize for my inexcusable behavior toward you on that Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace. I placed my hands on you without permission while you were performing your duties, and I treated you with disrespect and disregard for your service and your dignity as a person. There is no excuse for my actions. I was frustrated about a tour booking issue, but that frustration did not give me the right to approach you inappropriately, to ignore the boundaries of your position, or to make physical contact with you while you were serving our countries. Through my community service with military families, I have learned about the sacrifices that you and your fellow service members make every day. The dedication, the discipline, the commitment to duty that you demonstrated even in the face of my inappropriate behavior reflects the best of military service. I am deeply sorry for any stress or discomfort my actions caused you. I am sorry for the spectacle I created that brought unwanted attention to you and your regiment. And I am sorry for failing to show you the respect that you deserve simply as a human being doing his job. I have learned from this experience, and I am committed to treating all people with the dignity and respect they deserve. I hope that my actions going forward will honor the lesson you taught me through your professionalism and grace under pressure. With sincere apologies and respect, Karen Mitchell." The letter was reviewed and approved by the court, and Karen was informed that it had been delivered to James Crawford. She would never know his response, but writing it had been an important step in her own process of taking responsibility for her actions. As her time in London drew to a close, Karen found herself changed in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first approached that royal guard 8 weeks earlier. The anger that had driven so much of her behavior had been replaced by something quieter but more sustainable, an understanding of her impact on others and a commitment to treating people with basic human dignity. The night before her return to Cleveland, Karen and Michael sat in their hotel room packing the belongings they had accumulated during their extended stay. The room that had felt like a prison had become oddly comfortable, and Karen realized she was nervous about returning to her old life. "What happens when we go home?" she asked Michael. He was quiet for a long moment, folding clothes with the careful precision he had developed over years of business travel. "I don't know, Karen. I really don't know. Are we going to be okay?" The question came out smaller than she intended, revealing the vulnerability she had been carrying for weeks. Michael looked at her directly for the first time in days. "That depends on whether the changes I've seen in you here are real, or whether you'll go back to being the person you were before." Karen nodded, understanding that this was perhaps the most important test she would face. It was one thing to change in the aftermath of public humiliation and legal consequences. It was another thing entirely to maintain that change when the immediate crisis had passed. The flight home was quiet, with Karen spending most of the journey thinking about the people she had met during her community service. The military families who had welcomed her help despite knowing her story. The children who had trusted her with their precious holiday party preparations. The colleagues at Support Our Soldiers who had treated her with kindness even as they knew she was there as part of her punishment. Back in Cleveland, Karen faced the challenge of rebuilding her life and her reputation. Some friends and neighbors were curious about her experience, others were judgmental about her behavior, and many seemed uncertain how to treat her now that she was the subject of international viral fame. At work, Karen's supervisor gave her a choice: accept a demotion to a role with no customer interaction, or find employment elsewhere. Karen chose the demotion, recognizing that she needed to prove her changed behavior rather than simply asserting it. The most difficult conversation came with her elderly mother, who had seen the video and struggled to understand how her daughter could have behaved in such a manner. "I raised you to be better than that," her mother said during their first meeting after Karen's return. "You did, Mom," Karen replied. "And I lost sight of those lessons somewhere along the way. But I'm trying to find them again." 6 months later, Karen received an unexpected phone call. Colonel Morrison from Support Our Soldiers was calling to tell her about an opening for a coordinator position with their organization. It would mean a significant pay cut from her previous job, but it would allow her to continue the work she had found meaningful during her community service. "We've been impressed with the feedback from the families you worked with," Colonel Morrison explained. "And, frankly, your experience with navigating difficult situations and advocating for people could be valuable skills if channeled properly." Karen accepted the position, seeing it as an opportunity to turn her experience into something positive. It wasn't the career she had planned, but it was work that mattered in ways her previous job never had. A year after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Karen received a letter forwarded through her solicitor in London. It was from James Crawford. "Brief but gracious, Mrs. Mitchell, I received your apology letter and wanted to acknowledge its receipt. I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility for what happened and your commitment to learning from the experience. I hope your work with military families has been meaningful for you and beneficial for those you serve. Respectfully, J. Crawford." Coldstream Guards. Karen read the letter several times, touched by his courtesy and professionalism even in this private communication. She had wronged him publicly, and he had responded with the same dignity he had shown during their original encounter. That evening, Karen looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, studying the face that had become recognizable around the world for all the wrong reasons. The lines were deeper now, etched by stress and hard-earned wisdom. But the anger that had once dominated her expression was gone, replaced by something calmer and more thoughtful. The woman who had approached James Crawford that Tuesday morning in London had been driven by entitlement, frustration, and a deep-seated need to dominate every interaction. The woman looking back from the mirror now understood that true respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned through how you treated others, especially those who couldn't fight back. Karen's story had become a cautionary tale shared millions of times across social media platforms. But, for her, it had become something else entirely, a second chance to become the person she should have been all along. The line she had crossed that day at Buckingham Palace had led to consequences she never could have imagined. But, on the other side of those consequences, she had found something unexpected, the possibility of redemption, and the knowledge that it was never too late to choose kindness over conflict, empathy over entitlement, and respect over the need to always be right. The Royal Guard had taught her the most important lesson of her life without saying a word, simply by maintaining his dignity in the face of her worst behavior. And, for that lesson, Karen would be grateful for the rest of her days.